In high school, I spent my weekends perfecting the craft of speech and debate. I dedicated what precious little extra time I had to learn how to communicate my thoughts clearly and effectively. After 4 years of this, I thought I had a pretty good idea of how to express myself. But one day in group therapy, one of my fellow members looked me in the eye and said, "Mariha, you share with us, but it feels like you only share what you think we want to hear." Well, there goes 4 years of speech and debate tournaments. She wasn't wrong, though. I had learned how to project an image of myself, but the real me was hidden inside a shell, almost like I lived my life like a turtle. I had grown to figure out how to clearly express myself through this shell, but I was afraid of poking my head out. I was afraid of vulnerability. I was afraid to look inward and see who was really inside this shell. It took me a long time to realize that I was doing myself a disservice. It took me a long time to realize there's a real big question here. Why? Why is vulnerability and being vulnerable with the people that you trust, and especially yourself, considered so dangerous? I held this mentality that vulnerability was something that should be feared. I allowed myself to fear vulnerability to the extent that I ended up having generalized depression and anxiety. I held this mentality for a majority of my life that vulnerability in our world is a moot endeavor, that we are in a world that is constantly full of hardships. It feels like everywhere we go, we have to be strong. That vulnerability should not be in our personal dictionary. But I was wrong. It wasn't until my diagnosis of generalized depression and anxiety that I realized that I had to reflect on what my emotions meant. I had to reflect on the importance that my emotions carry and realize that they're not a burden. I had to remind myself that I have internal emotional instincts that are so important, and there's a reason that I have them. So, tonight, let's embrace our vulnerability. First, we will learn to acknowledge our emotions and the power they carry. Next, we will learn to accept that our emotions are not a burden, but rather they are the most important part of who we are. Finally, we will learn to appreciate our inner voice. Looking back, I had been growing that so-called turtle shell for a really long time. Like many Muslim Americans, I grew up under the inescapable shadow of 9/11, the shadow that had such a constant presence in my life that I almost kind of chose to ignore it. But still, to shield myself from it, I decided that I was going to be impervious to the Islamophobia, bigotry, and racism that exists at the heart of our society. I decided that I was going to be the strong Muslim woman that I did not see on the TV. I started wearing the hijab, I began championing local community causes, and I tried to be a leader in my community as well. While these things benefited myself and my community, they also grew to become part of the shell that I thought was protecting me from the daily stigma and racism that just exists in our society. But I was fooling myself. This shell was not my so-called armor, but rather it was my Achilles heel. I was choosing to ignore the wounds that society was inflicting upon me. And I wasn't alone in my misperception. Several psychological studies from the past 2 decades have indicated untreated PTSD and anxiety in Muslim Americans. In her case study, Muslim Americans, the complex identity after 9/11, Sociology professor from Temple University, Michelle Bing, writes, "Immigrants to the United States are forced to let go of their identity and their culture to assimilation. But at the same time, these immigrants and their children try to hold on to their ethnic culture to preserve their traditions and identity. In this constant tug of war, it feels so much easier to just lay down your weapons and stay in the realm of the in-between. This lack of concrete identity leads to an increased risk of PTSD and anxiety, as noted in several 2009 case studies on Muslim Americans and mental illness risk factors. But along with this predisposition to mental illness, the stigma around mental health creates a culture of, I'm fine. I'm fine is a cover-up. I'm fine is knowing that something's not fine, but still talking about it would just manifest its effects. I'm fine was not going to stop the impact that depression and anxiety had on my life. My pain was real. My pain was affecting my health, my education, and my quality of life. But why could I not open up and be vulnerable with myself about these feelings? Why was I so afraid to poke my head outside of my shell? What was stopping me from acknowledging these feelings and productively acting on them? Emotional self-disclosure is the ability of an individual to acknowledge their emotions and respond accordingly. In a 2009 American Psychiatric Association study, it was found that individuals with a lack of emotional self-disclosure also seem to have heightened symptoms of depression and anxiety. This means that people with depression and anxiety chose not to acknowledge their emotions because, come on, you have depression and anxiety. The pain that you're going to be feeling is something that you don't know how to act on. But emotional self-disclosure is an act of vulnerability. In order to be vulnerable with yourself, you have to learn that your emotions are not a burden. You have to learn to accept your emotions, because your emotions are your motivators. They add intention to your action. They make you who you are. So now, we've acknowledged our emotions. So let's look at accepting our emotions. Raise your hand if you've recently had a conversation with someone that you trust about your deep concerns or your feelings. Now, keep your hand raised if you apologized at the conclusion of this conversation for sharing those feelings. I think I still see everyone's hands up. Why? Why did we apologize for sharing who we are with someone that we trust and love? Why do we apologize? When do we apologize? We apologize when we're giving someone a burden. We apologize when we give someone an inconvenience. We apologize when we're making a mistake. When I would try to talk to my therapist, my friends, my family, my parents, I would feel a 30-pound weight on my chest and a block in my throat. Being vulnerable meant that the Islamophobia, racism, and bigotry that I fought so hard to deny did in fact have an impact on me. Being vulnerable felt like a grave mistake. It wasn't until I spent time in group therapy that I learned that it wasn't the actions that were causing my guilt, but rather the act of being myself. Meaning that being vulnerable wasn't the cause of my guilty verdict, but rather just being me. Okay, so what does that mean when you are hurting and you desperately need help? That means that you have to acknowledge and accept that what you are sharing with those that you love is not going to hurt them. It's not going to burden them. You're not inconveniencing them. Group therapy helped me learn that I was choosing not to acknowledge and accept my emotions because I was the burden in my eyes. But expressing myself is not a mistake. Expressing my emotions should not be ever considered a mistake, and it should not ever be considered a burden. My emotions are a gift. They're a gift from the purest part of my soul. They're the greatest thing that I could ever share with anyone. Learning this broke that shell. It freed me. It gave me the chance to connect with my loved ones and my friends. But most importantly, it gave me the chance to connect with myself. Now that we've learned to accept and acknowledge our emotions, let's move on to learning how to appreciate them. I have this little inner voice, and I think most of us all do. Can we all say hi to that inner voice real quick? But you all know who I'm talking about, right? You know that one voice that wakes you up at 2 a.m. in the morning and then reminds you of the most embarrassing things that happened in 7th grade? Half the time you have a midterm the next morning too. So we're really mean to this voice, right? We beat it up for saying too much. We beat it up for not saying enough, and then everything in between. But this inner voice is really, really important to who we are. This inner voice is who we are. It's that person inside the shell that I was choosing not to look at. I was choosing to ignore and refuse its presence. There's this great quote from this book, I'm sure you may have heard of it, Call Me By Your Name. Andre Osman conveys this message that being vulnerable and opening up about your feelings is the greatest thing that you could ever do. He says, we rip out so much of ourselves to not feel anything. We rip out so much of ourselves to not feel anything that we go bankrupt by the age of 30, so that we have less to offer each time we start with someone new, but to feel nothing so as not to feel anything. What a waste. Why are we wasting this gift of emotion? Why are we wasting the ability to connect with others and connect with ourselves? This is where your inner voice comes back in. It's time to reconcile with that inner voice. It's time to say, thank you. Thank you for everything that you do. Thank you for giving us that gut feeling when we know we're not being treated equally. Thank you for telling us we do have a crush on that guy and we do want to talk to them. Thank you for being honest, for trying to tell us what we are truly feeling when we're trying so hard to deny it. Breaking out of that shell and accepting that inner voice, it feels like a lot. It kind of feels like I'm asking you to run out to the world and share all of your deepest, darkest secrets and your fears and aspirations. And in a way, I am. But the world I'm asking you to express all of that to is you. I'm asking you to be vulnerable with yourself so that in turn, you will also be vulnerable with your friends and your family. I cannot even fathom how much joy I denied myself by denying this voice and this emotion that I felt for so long. I've been alive for 20 years, so 19 years of choosing to live in a shell. And let me tell you, 10 out of 10, I recommend getting out of that shell. For so long, I lived my life like a lizard. Not like a lizard, as a turtle. For so long, I lived my life as a turtle. Hold on, wait with me. I lived my life like a turtle. I chose to stay in that shell. I chose to never free myself from that shell. But it was a lie. I was supposed to live like a lizard. I was supposed to live my life in the open with my strong scales protecting me. I had told myself for so long that I needed to be in that shell because my scales were not strong enough and my scales were not going to protect me. But I didn't need that protection. I was denying myself so much. I was denying myself a lot. But tonight, let's embrace our vulnerability. Let's learn to acknowledge our emotions. Let's learn to accept the great gifts that they are. Because living life like a turtle with a bulky shell holds us back from experiencing so much. Instead, let's brace the strong scales of a lizard and live our life free of this shell. Appreciating, accepting, and acknowledging. It is not a change that happens overnight. This is not a linear process, it's a cyclical one. And I'm so sorry to say that. But there's so much joy in this journey. There's so much joy. I am just starting my journey. Writing this talk was a part of it. Writing this talk made me acknowledge everything I've been through. It made me accept everything I've been through. And now I'm appreciating it in front of all of you. To share your truth is honestly an awe-inspiring feeling, and I wish it upon every single one of you in this room. So, the time is now. The time is now to embrace and accept, acknowledge, and appreciate our vulnerability and our emotions. The time is now to leave our shell and start that transition from turtle to lizard. Because to feel nothing, so as not to feel anything. What a waste. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.